everyone, welcome to the latest stream of React 2025. In this stream we're going to be talking about creating the feedback pages that we'll be using for collecting and displaying feedback for the sites that you enter in on your dashboard. So we're going to couple a couple different things today. I'm going to show where we left off last time. We're going to jump in and create some static pages for getting feedback from our site. We're going to do dynamic routing on those pages. We're going to use getStaticPaths and getStaticProps to do that. And finally, we're going to reorganize some of the Firebase admin logic that we currently have in place to connect and grab feedback from that collection that we will create. So, just got my checklist here to make sure we're all set up and ready to go. I want to quickly show where we left off last time. I'm going to turn this down a little. So last time we were working on the admin page and using SWR to fetch information from an API route and then display a list of sites so that you can view feedback links for every single site that you own and manage. And then eventually we're also going to create another admin page where you can manage and approve the feedback that list. But I want to jump ahead a little bit and start creating the actual feedback pages so that we can get that user input. Do now is jump right into starting to create the feedback page. Now we don't have a table created, so let's actually start with trying to get some data. So if we go back over to our Firebase database, we have sites, we have users, but we don't have any feedback. So I'm just going to manually create it through here, and then as we get a little bit further along, we're going to create this through an input. So we're going to say this is feedback, and we will give it an auto ID, and this is going to take something like the author. We'll just say this is myself, the author ID, which I'm going to have to get because I don't know exactly what it is, when it was created, what the provider was, so like Twitter or something. Eventually we might add a rating field in here as well, so I'm just going to put this in here for now. I'd thought through some of these schemas ahead of time. The site ID, that will be a string. The status, so we're going to use this enum to allow us to determine if it's pending, approved, or removed. So we'll say this one is just going to be pending. And then finally, the text content that will be inside of that piece of feedback. So this looks like a decent start. Oh, that's why it was. I was wondering why it wouldn't let me hit save, but it's because I didn't have a number for 5. So that looks good. I want to go to sites. I'm going to pick a random site in here. I'll just pick my own site. I'm going to steal the author ID. And if I go back to sites, I'm also going to steal the site ID. Hello world. I'm going to get the, let's see. Where are we saving off a timestamp? Right here. I'm going to take something like this, just copy this format. Okay, this looks pretty decent. I want to make sure that the provider was lowercase, github.com. Oh yeah, the only provider I have set up right now is GitHub, so I'm just going to keep that the same. Okay, that looks decent. So we have our feedback in the database. now what I want to do is create an API or just some sort of function for us to fetch that information. And since we're going to be using this inside of getStaticProps and getStaticPaths, which I'll explain in a second, we actually don't want to put it behind an API route because those functions are already in the Node.js context. So if I go over to our file, we had already set up a database for doing client-side reads with Firebase. So we want to do something similar, but we want to start doing this for the admin database. So let's do db admin, and we can get rid of that. This is going to be Firebase admin, and we're just going to call this, we want to get all of the feedback. And rather than doing this inside of this file, we already export it where we are connecting to Firestore. So we already have that set up. So I'm just going to use this as reference, but it's not exactly necessary. So we'll just say we're going to export this new function. It's going to be asynchronous, get all feedback, and we want to get feedback for a specific site. Okay. So now inside of here, we're going to await the result of talking to Firebase, and we want to pull this new collection, which is feedback. Then on that collection, we want to filter, so use where, to say we only want this where the site ID is going to be equal to whatever site ID that we pass in. Okay? And then we want to actually fetch that document, so we can use get for that. We need to save this to a variable, so we'll just say this is a snapshot at a current state and time of the feedback matching that condition. I'm going to save so that formats. And then the way this works, if you remember from last time, basically we have to get some kind of snapshot, make a variable, and then iterate over those values. So I'm just going to copy this in here, format that on save. This is going to be all the feedback that we want, and then for each value in the feedback, we're going to push that inside here, and we spread all of the documents data that we get back from the database, so all of these different fields, and then we're also going to include this ID in here as well from the actual record. This is looking good. I think the only thing remaining here would be to then return the feedback. I don't even need this anymore. So given this, get all of the feedback and then return it. That looks good. So one way that we can quickly test this is just set up an API route. We don't necessarily need this for what we're going to do, but it allows us to verify that this connection is working. So maybe I want to say, inside of API, let's do a new folder for feedback. And then we're going to have a new file. And we're going to pass in some site ID. So let me just take what we started here for this API route and put it inside of here. So we don't need to go directly to the database like we were doing here, because we've actually created a little helper function that will allow us to do that. So really what we want to do is we'll say feedback equals get all feedback, and we should get that auto import. So get all feedback from library database admin. This gets us all of the feedback. Let me just make sure my stream isn't lagging. Stream's looking good. That's good. Okay. So we want to get all of the feedback here, and then let's actually return that feedback. There is the possibility that this could go wrong. So what we might want to do is surround this in a try catch. Or we could just check if there's an error. We might want to move that directly into the library function, but for now this is fine. One piece that's missing is that site ID, and we're going to be able to pull that off given the request. So we talked about response in the last stream on how we can send status codes and then JSON back to the user. Well, the request is another little helper that we have that will allow us to then pull off this site ID. So we might say site ID is going to be equal to request.query.siteID. So given this site ID, we pass that in to get all feedback. It will return this feedback, and let me just jump into here. It then returns this value. That's looking good. So I need to know the site ID. And this was, let me just make sure this is still working. Yep, API, feedback. Okay, so we have feedback, but we're not getting anything back. Probably because I didn't await a response of that. Let's try this again. Woohoo! Okay, sweet. So we are successfully connected to our database. We are able to get feedback back. This is looking good. Okay. I'm gonna just pause on this now that we know that it works. And we're going to jump back to our pages and start talking about how to build out the feedback page. So let me collapse API. At least the way I was initially thinking this, I was going to have routes at /p/id. I could change that, but I'm just going to stick with that for now. So I'm going to have a new folder /p, and then inside of there is going to be a dynamic route that has the site ID. And this is going to be all of the feedback for this specific site. Maybe I'll do, yeah, I'll just leave that for now. So basically, the way this dynamic route works is we can pass in any value for this ID, similar like to what we just did for API/feedback/whatever we pass in, and that gets actually forwarded as a variable down to that file as the name of site ID. So you can name this whatever you want, and it allows you to just put any dynamic value in there. So this works perfect for us because we want to have a page for every single site. So I'm just going to just copy over the basis of this. We're going to call this the feedback, well, site feedback, how about? And then we want to start adding getStaticProps and getStaticPaths so that we can generate this. So I have the docs pulled up over here, and I'm just going to quickly copy some of these things in. There's getStaticProps. Saves me from typing it out. And getStaticPaths. For now, we're not going to mess around with that, and I'll explain this in a second. And this is going to be site ID. We'll just say this is. Do I still have that on my keyboard? No, I don't. I'm gonna hard code this to start, just so that we can see what it looks like, and then we can start talking about this a little bit more. Let's see. We'll just say that this is format this. I have this site ID. We'll go back to /p/that ID. Okay, cool. So we have the route created. That's a good start. And we're seeing our hello world. Let's take a minute to actually talk through what we're working with here. So getStaticProps and getStaticPaths are two methods that were introduced in Next.js 9.3 that allow us to generate static sites based on dynamic content. So what that means is you can have complex data requirements like all of our feedback data in a Firebase database, yet I still want the output that is shipped to users to be a static site. And the good thing about this is that static sites are very performant, and they allow us a lot of benefits like putting it on CDN and having that be instantaneous for your users, having less downtime, less opportunity for database vulnerabilities when you're just shipping static sites. So in general, they're really great and they make for a great developer experience. So these methods make it easy then to generate static sites. So the first one, getStaticProps, given some data that we fetch from our database or an API, we can return this as props to our React component down here. So you'll see I defined initial feedback. I can then destructure my props here and actually get that value of initial feedback. Now this context we can actually utilize to understand what was passed in from our dynamic route. So if I wanted to pull off that site ID, I can say context.params.site ID. And now I know specifically what value was passed in the URL. So like that API route, right? I can go back and say, I want to fetch all of the feedback, and I'm going to await get all feedback. We'll auto import that, and we can pass in the site ID. So given that value in the route, get all of the feedback, and then let's pass that down as the initial feedback to this route. Now the reason I call it initial feedback is because there's going to be an input that will allow them to gather more feedback. So I'm going to save this, and then the second one is getStaticPaths. So for this dynamic route, we have X number of sites, and we want to generate a route for every single site that we have available. So when you sub in that site ID, it tells getStaticPaths which routes are available. So right now we can do /p/this ID, but if I were to do some other ID that doesn't exist, because fallback is false, this will 404. Now, what we can do in the future is turn this to true, which will allow us to fetch from the database on that first time, rather than having it 404. So we might swing back and do that later, but for now, let's just get all of these sites that are available. And I mentioned that we don't want to call API routes directly inside of these functions because they're in the node context. But we had already created an API route to get all the sites. So really we just want to abstract this into our DB admin and then reuse it there. So let me just take this, get all sites. We'll cut this. So we await Firebase, sites, get. For each of the sites, push it onto that value, and then return sites. That looks good. I'm just going to go ahead and update this while we're here. So const sites equals await get all sites, and then return those values, and my auto import updated. Just a quick sanity check to make sure this is working. Okay, that's still working. I'm gonna close out of this because we probably won't need that again. I don't need this. Okay, so inside of here, I want to get all the sites using that helper function that we just had. And then rather than hard coding these paths, what we want to do is say for all of the sites, we want to map over each site. And we're going to return an object that's going to have this structure with params. And the site ID is going to be the site ID. And then we want to stringify that. So that looks pretty good. We can use the shorthand object notation on paths so that it will infer a key of paths and then the value of whatever this variable is. That looks good. So now, this page should still work, right? It does. And if I go to sites and I pick another random site, it should know about this and not 404. Perfect. Okay. That's a good start. This site is the one that actually has feedback attached to it. So let's go ahead and start messing with this one. So, given this feedback, what we can do is just say, I want to map over all of these pieces of feedback, and then we're going to return and use our new feedback component that I created ahead of time. And this takes in a few different values, but most importantly, we need to include a key since we are iterating over the initial feedback value. And this is just a React fundamental. And the key will be the ID of that feedback. And then all of the values inside of that feedback object, we're just going to spread to the component. And this component destructures that and pulls off the author, text, and created at. Author, text, created at. Okay, that looks good. Let me go back to here. Nice. Awesome. So yeah, I created this UI component ahead of time. We just put some dummy data in the database, and it is showing my name, the time it was created, and then the contents of that feedback. So we got a pretty good start here. The next piece on this page is an important one, which is actually allowing the ability to add feedback. So let's start by improving the styling a little bit here. I'm going to cut this, and a box for Chakra UI is essentially like a div that has style props available. So on this box, we're going to do flex direction of column, width of full, and we want to do a max width of, let's say, 700, and center it with margin of auto. So the top and the bottom are 0, and the left and the right are auto. It could maybe even be a bit smaller than that, but that's a decent start. Let's also, yeah, that's fine. The next thing we want to do is create an input. So if I go to Chakra Docs, I'm going to need a form control, something like this, to allow us to input some text. So I guess I'll just start from here. I'm going to need to import all this stuff, so it's going to fail. Come on, auto import. Okay, well, I get no auto import, so that's fun. Form control, form label, input. Okay, that's a good start. This is going to be some kind of comment or feedback. We'll just say this is comment. There is no description text anymore. I'm gonna put some margin on this guy. Wait for it. Okay, that looks a little bit better. What now? We need a button. Auto import does not like me today. Whoa. Okay, I'm gonna reload my editor here. See if that gets my auto import going again. There we go. That's better. Now where's my auto import? Still not there, but at least I got the closing tag. And this button will just say add comments. That should get rid of the error that we're seeing. Let me just refresh this. Oh, whoops. When I reloaded my window, it killed my dev server. So I need to restart at yarn dev. Wait for it. Okay. It's looking decent. I don't like that this isn't font weight of medium. Okay. And this button is actually going to submit our form. Also needs margin on the top. Okay, that looks good. Let's actually try saving something and seeing if we can get it inside of the database. So on submit of the form will be when we want to actually send this over. So this form control, I don't think renders a form. It doesn't. So I'm going to wrap this inside of a form. It has an on submit, which will be, this will be, well, sure. I need to define on submit or it's going to blow up. Let's make sure this is working. I'm sure it is, but better to be safe than sorry. Okay, so when we click on our button as a type of submit, which triggers the on submit for that form, and we are able to see that in a console log. You'll notice the page reloaded though, and that's because that's the default behavior for forms. So what we want to do is take the event, whoa, not that. Take the event and do a prevent default so that it does not refresh the page. Now we need to get the value and start setting this up so that we can save it to the database. We have the author, which will be, we're gonna have to pull that from our use auth hook. Use auth, so that's auth.user.name. The author ID, which is the user ID, the site ID, which is going to have to be pulled from the URL. So this is a good opportunity to talk about the router. Let's see if I can find a good example. Yeah, here we go. So we can utilize the use router hook to pull that value that we are dynamically using. So if I say I want to do use router, I can say this will be the router, and then I'm able to do router.query.siteid to pull that value in. That looks good. What else do we need? We need the contents of what is inside of there, so we need to fetch that from the input element. There's a few ways that we could do this. I'm just gonna go ahead and do a React ref. So I'll say this is the input element, and I will use ref from React. Initially it is null. And let's go to our input element, and we're gonna say the ref on this is the input element. This gives us, ref is just short for a reference. So we have a reference to our input element. We can do input l dot the current DOM node. We want to pull the value of that DOM node. We also need created at. So we want a new date, and we want to do an ISO string. What else do we want? We want whatever the provider was. Let's pull this up and make sure I'm getting it all. Whatever the provider was, which we had on the user, and then the status, which initially will be pending. Auth user provider, yeah. Okay, that all looks decent. Let's save this to the database. So I want to create feedback and give it the new feedback. But create feedback does not exist. So since we're doing this on the client side, I mean, we could use the Firebase admin if we wanted to, but I'm just gonna go ahead and do this on our client side. So like we did create site, I'm just gonna say create feedback. It'll take in some data, Firestore, collection, feedback, and then add that data. Come on. So we imported create feedback. Oh no, my imports are all screwed up. It doesn't really matter. It's basically just personal preference, but I kind of like to separate things out a little bit just so it's a little bit more clear. Like these are third party, these are inside of my code base. It just helps me with organization a little bit. You can actually set up ESLint rules if you want to enforce that. So what this will do is on submit of this form, fetch the value that we put in the input, and then actually save that off with Firebase. Okay, so we will say very helpful comment here. And I don't know if that worked or not. The only way I'll know is if I refresh the page. It worked. Okay. Obviously, that's not the greatest. We don't want to have to refresh the page every time. So what we could do is do a local mutation of that data. So we have our initial feedback and we save it on the database, but if we want to make this feel more instantaneous, what we could do is use React State to update that feedback. So we'll say that we want all of the feedback and then a setter for all feedback to use React State, and the initial state of that is actually the initial feedback. Just want to make sure this auto imported, and it didn't, so I'm going to put that up there. So we have all feedback, and then we want to set all feedback. Rather than using the initial feedback, then we want to iterate over all the feedback. And then before or after we create the actual feedback in the database, we can set all feedback. Now what we might want to do is have some better error handling here in the future, where if it actually failed to save to the database, then we would not add it or display some error message to the user. Right now this is doing what you might have heard of as optimistic UI, where we're just assuming that it works. And if it fails, then we could prompt the user and let them know that it didn't work. So we want to set all feedback, and what we want to do is pass in a new array that has the new feedback as well as all of the existing feedback. So we spread out all of the contents of the existing feedback and we create a new array that contains all of them. So in doing this, we should be able to see when we type in a comment, it updates React State locally, and we see that new feedback being added. If I can spell. Perfect. Okay, that's great. We're seeing that local mutation happen right away. One thing that I'm noticing that doesn't look great is that the feedback, is not ordered by the date. So let's go ahead and do that, because we probably want the newest feedback to show first. So if I go back into our dbadmin function that we were using to get all of the feedback, after I've fetched all the feedback, what we want to do is say, let's sort all of that. And this sort is going to take a comparator that takes in the first and then the second thing that we want to compare. Now, we've already set up date functions inside of this repository, so we can use that to compare dates. And there's ascending or descending depending on how you want to compare things. So we can do compare descending because we want the newest ones to be shown first. Again, I'm just going to reorganize that. Okay, so we want to compare these descending, and these, let's see, this takes in a actual date object, which means that we currently only have the ISO strings, so we're going to want to parse. Yeah, we're going to want to parse a.created. I think it's created at. Yes. Whoops. So this will take the first date, and we want to compare that with the second one, which will be B created at. So now when this page refreshes, we should see the June 9th one show up on the bottom. And we do. Perfect. Okay, so that's looking really good. We're making pretty good progress here. One thing I'm thinking about is that when we embed this page, we're probably going to want two different types. We're going to want an embed where there's actually a link to go comment, and then we're going to want a page like this, which links out to fast feedback where you can actually do the commenting. I haven't decided if I want to do that in this stream or do it in another stream. Let's see. We did create static pages to get feedback for a site. We did some dynamic routing. getStaticProps, getStaticPaths. Okay, let's see. What else should we cover in this stream? One thing that we could do would be doing a little bit of error handling a bit better. So if we go to our database admin, let's say that when we were trying to fetch some of this information, some kind of error came up when talking with Firebase, whether our internet went out or Firebase was down or whatever. What we might want to do is take the contents of this and wrap it in a try catch. So this is going to be the content that we want to try, and if that fails, we want to catch whatever error that is and probably return that error. I'm going to do that in an object, which means this should probably be an object. Now we're going to have to change how we consume getAllFeedback, because now we have an object with a key of feedback or an object with a key of error. So, for example, getAllFeedback here, this is now an object with feedback. So I can just destructure this. Okay, that looks right. And then we have our API route somewhere in here too, which we probably want to surface it here. So get the result back. If there was an error, let's return that error as a 500. And otherwise return. I feel like we could, it might be better if I just did it like this, destructure, feedback, or error. So try to get all the feedback. If there's an error, return a 500 with that error. Otherwise, return the feedback. That looks pretty good. Oop. Throw a space in there. Let me refresh and make sure this is still good. Okay. Might also not be a bad idea to add this to our other API route. So let me just gonna copy this over. So sites or error. If there was an error, return the error. Otherwise, return the sites. And throw this in a try and have a catch. That looks good to me. Another sanity check is I will just go back to our dashboard, which was displaying the sites. And yeah, I'm gonna need to update some more places here. Let's do a quick find all. Updated the API, but then I also need to update this file. Get all sites. That looks good. And then on our dashboard, I was consuming this from API sites and it was pulling data back. So if there's no data, we're loading. Otherwise, data at sites. I think that's actually still, yeah, that's still accurate. We just might want to have some kind of error handling here at some point. Let's check this, make sure we're still working. That is still working. And this is also still working. Cool. Let's see. One thing that we might want to do is throw our feedback link inside of here. And this is going to be on the pages that we want to embed. So kind of my thought process here was when you embed the form on a website, you would have people come out to the fast feedback website to do their commenting rather than doing it inline on the site. The reason for this is that we want to make sure that people are authenticated, and I think having that extra step in place would be nice. Another thing that we could do is check for a cookie and see if that is valid, and if it is, then just directly show the comment form. But I think for right now, this might be a faster kind of MVP approach that would allow me just to link out to leave a comment and call that good. So we might want to do that here. One other thing I just noticed that's going to need to get done is if I go to the dashboard, I'm just going to close all of these, pull up the dashboard and the site table, we have a link to feedback. And this actually isn't doing anything right now. We have the chakra link component, but what we want to do is actually link this to stuff. So we're going to use a next link. And I'm pretty sure the chakra link component is an A tag, which is good because the first child of a next link needs to be an A. Notice I called this next link because the link namespace was already taken by the chakra component. And I'm just going to import next link from next link. And what we want to do here is the file that we're linking to is going to be /p/site ID. I don't need the JS. This is the actual file that we're linking to, but then we want to render it as a string that contains the actual ID. So if we use some string interpolation here, we're going to say that this is site dot UI. Is it UID or ID? I think it's just ID. Okay, and then we also want to pass this href down to the link. Okay, so this page reloaded. I added feedback to my personal site on here, and you see that in the hover, it's correctly showing the site ID And then clicking here, I should get, hopefully, yeah. So when that's compiled for production, it will seem a lot quicker, but the reason it's slower in development is because that page is still having to be built on the fly. In production, when it's already built, you'll get that really fast, seamless client-side transition. But this is working as I would expect it to. So we're making progress here. And I think I've pretty much covered everything that I want to do with this stream. I don't want to drag on. I want to make sure that I have very separate pieces of functionality broken down so it's easy for everyone to consume and kind of work through at their own pace or watch through at a faster speed when they want to catch up later. So I think with this, we made some pretty good progress, and I think I'm just going to call it for this stream. So thanks for watching. If you're coding along, keep chugging along, and I'll get a PR for this put up to GitHub for everyone to review. So let me just change my stream back. Yeah, so thank you everyone who tuned in, and thank you to everyone following along later. Really appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me directly at me@leerob.io or message me on Twitter, and I'll try to get back to you as fast as I can. So